When we think of depression, we have potentially a concept, we have a label that is a symbol. That label is a symbol of a set pattern of behavior or mood or inner experiences that over time streams and a vast diverse network of people have experienced, and in experiencing that and in sharing those experiences and being part of a network of psychology and of medicine and of understanding of the human condition, we've identified a trend. And in identifying a trend, we've applied a label to that trend. But depression is not a thing. You might be experiencing something that has all the hallmarks that you would apply to the label and the symbol of depression. And that's not to minimize, and that's not to say that there's no such thing in terms of the experience is invalid or it's not real or it's not intrusive. If 1,000 people display a certain behavior or motivation or feeling or mood, then that signifies that there's a commonality in that. And through that commonality, there's a potential for understanding. So with psychology, when we look at the psychology of depression in terms of trying to find solutions for that, we look at those trends, we identify what is potentially wrong or what the experience entails, and then we look at solutions based upon that. And that's great, that's incredibly useful and incredibly supportive. And it's reassuring to have this label and have this understanding in the beginning. Let's say that you are diagnosed with depression. In that experience, right, you've gone through a process where, and speaking for me personally, like when I was first diagnosed with depression, it was because I was noticing certain patterns in my subjective experience. I was experiencing a low mood and anxiety and a dullness and a sense of hopelessness. And if you were to look at the checklist or the trends and the patterns that link to depression, it wouldn't take much to see that I was quote unquote depressed. We can kind of reverse engineer this, okay? So if you're being really super mindful to your experience, there is no such thing as depression. There might be unresolved trauma. There might be certain unhelpful thinking processes. There might be a lack of emotional regulation, etc., etc. But if we can be really expanded and open towards that experience, we'll start to disintegrate the label and we'll start to see it as an experience in any given moment. One that might be a trend, one that might be a pattern over time. But what we can also do is internalize the label and internalize depression as a thing. And then all of a sudden, you see yourself as a depressed person. Or you say, I am depressed. And then what starts to happen is your internal subjective direct experience is influenced by this narrative, right? The research of psychology and the knowledge that we have around depression has almost given us a pre-packaged idea of what depression is. So as soon as you're given that label, you're also given all the beliefs, you're also given all the storylines and the underlying assumptions about what depression means. It's like going to IKEA and picking depression up, flat pack, assembled, ready to go. You've got the instructions and now you know what depression is, now you know how to measure your experience. If you allow self-awareness to be present, then you can notice the nuances and the minutiae of the subjective experiences that you would label depression, right? But the trouble is, when we reverse that and we're pre-packaged, we take that pre-packaging of depression and what that means, and that might involve beliefs like I'll never be happy again, like there's something wrong with me, like I'll never fully recover. You know, anything, any assumptions and beliefs that we have attached to that label, we then internalize. And when we internalize, and there are streams of studies to demonstrate this, when we internalize, we start behaving in accordance with our narratives, without self-awareness, without consciousness, without presence. So let's say that you have a belief, I am depressed, right? And then you become extra aware and extra conscious of how depressed you are, of all the low points in your experience. But in having this as an internalized narrative, we can blind ourselves to the other aspects of the experience. It can become part of our identity. But when we understand that what depression is a label and a concept applied to a pattern of behavior in the subjective experiences of many, many people over time, then we can just see it as something that we use as reassurance or something that we use for understanding. It can be as simple as, right, okay, now I get that. Now I understand why I've been feeling this way. This is something that is part of the shared human experience. It's something that I can connect to as a way of kind of relieving or accepting my experience. But understanding depression isn't a thing also allows us to move beyond it, to disintegrate that label, to see that it is a set pattern and that no pattern is fixed. Because then, when you really, really dissect it into its multitude, into the ingredients, then you start to pick it apart. And you don't just stop at this prepackaged understanding of narratives and ideas, because those narratives and those ideas are also distorted. They're not true necessarily. A lot of them are incredibly limited, especially in our Western view. Our language is a translation and a symbol for a pattern of behavior or subjective experience that's being translated through a trend. But in your own direct experience, there's no such thing as depression. There are only experiences of phenomena and sensation and thoughts that within themselves can show a trend that can be symbolized by the word depression. I hope this makes sense, right? But what I'm trying to point at is how, psychology isn't some transcendent truth. It's a collection of knowledge and understanding around trends of behavior. And in the spectrum of human experience, there are trends and there are behaviors that go into the criteria for depression. Like if you look at the DSM, the diagnostic manual, I forgot the middle word, but this is a way that mental illness is diagnosed, right? If you look at that now, you'll even find that grief can be pathologized. Now that's absurd. That is absurd. And the more that we're ready to just jump into the concept, to go to the top of the iceberg of experience, and to say, oh, depression, I'm not going to look any lower. I have that label, and I'm not going to go down. I'm not going to understand the framework and the richness of that experience. Then we remain here, and then we feel stuck. This idea of psychology being the detection of trends and patterns in human behavior, which is then presented as a concept, this is depression, which is then compared to your subjective experience. It might even be in a different kind of dynamic. It could be that a therapist has a client, and that client is sharing their experience, and then in this interaction, the therapist goes, oh, what you're displaying and what you're talking to is the experience of depression. Now it's interesting because if you think of one of the most common ways that depression is diagnosed, it's on a checklist of behavior. Why is that? Because over time, enough people have showed this behavior, they've demonstrated it, they've displayed it as a trend, as a pattern, so then psychology integrates that as part of the body of knowledge and then shares that knowledge and then looks for solutions based upon those patterns. One thing to be really conscious of as well is to look at, a lot of the time, those solutions, especially in our kind of capitalist and economically driven society, those solutions are driven by medication and by profit, right? So there's actually a profit motive in diagnosing more of the human experience so that there can be a solution in the form of a pill. So my call to you is to reject the notion of depression being a thing. And I say this with the greatest respect, right? Because I've had what I would certainly label as depression for the majority of my adult life. So it's not something I take lightly. But you will remain stuck if you see depression as a thing that is independent of you, a thing that you're a victim to. If, and just to like kind of display this, to give an example, like if miraculously, over the next 10 years, every single person, or at least the vast majority of people, who displayed symptoms of depression, they might be labelled with depression, spontaneously had significant spiritual awakenings, right? Let's just say 90% of people that had depression suddenly was went, oh, all this introspection and this existential despair has led me to a greater understanding of the cosmos and the universe and divinity and my role in all of this. Then our understanding of depression would shift, and it could be that 10 years on from that, suddenly depression is the prelude to spiritual awakening. Do you see what I mean with this? It's looking at how trends inform language and inform labels and inform concepts, but it's always evolving, it's always updating. It's not a thing, it's not a fixed thing. So if you're experiencing depression, if you feel depressed, allow that to be a label and nothing more. Allow it to be a reassurance if you need it, a tool for understanding. But know that it is not a thing. It's a label given to a pattern of behavior, a pattern of experience. Do all you can to detect these patterns, to detect the root causes of those patterns and the things that contribute to those patterns staying in place. You can unpick it. You can get to the root of those patterns. You can see how this behavior continues. And then you can find solutions to those micro problems. Not just one size fits all solution to depression. As we all know, there's no one cause for what we label depression, just as there's no one solution. So the more that you can dissect and understand the minutiae, the more you can look for solutions, little mini solutions along the way. It might be that there's something that needs to be healed. It might be that you're stuck in a feeling of resentment towards someone, and every little thing that you do along the way is a micro solution. And those micro solutions build up over time. So I hope that this lands. I hope that this makes sense. I hope you can see why I've arrived at the conclusion that there is no such thing as depression, and that our language can be a form of freedom and a form of understanding, or it can be our own prison. And our job is to take language, to see it for what it is, and then to become curious to everything in our experience.